Hey guys, tonight we begin with the halters and heartbreaking desperation of Victorian England. The brutal social machine that turned marriage into commerce and gave us proper divorce proceedings, women's rights, and the subtle art of selling your spouse while maintaining a stiff upper lip. So before you get too comfortable in your modern relationship, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me drag you through humanity's darker chapters. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and whether you've ever had to choose between dignity and survival. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to admit they're here for the historical train wrecks. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something strong for courage, and let's ease into tonight's journey through the market squares of despair. So, you think your marriage has problems? Adorable. Truly like complaining about your Wi-Fi speed while Rome burns around you. Tonight we're diving deep into a world where till death do us part was more of a suggestion than a binding contract, where love was a luxury the poor couldn't afford, and where the phrase, "I'm not your property," hadn't been invented yet because, well, technically you were. We're talking about Victorian wife selling, a practice so wonderfully twisted it makes modern divorce proceedings look like a friendly handshake over tea. Picture this, you're a Victorian gentleman, and I use that term as loosely as a noose around a condemned man's neck, standing in a market square with your beloved wife on a literal leash, hawking her virtues to strangers like she's a prize heifer. This isn't some fever dream cooked up by a particularly sadistic novelist. This actually happened, repeatedly, for decades, because apparently when society refuses to give you legal options, you get creative in ways that would make Kafka weep. So settle in, because we're about to explore how desperation, poverty, and spectacularly inadequate marriage laws combine to create one of history's most bizarre solutions to domestic problems. Fair warning, by the end of this, you'll either appreciate modern divorce courts or start eyeing your local farmer's market with entirely new interest. Picture this Victorian England, where the sun never set on the empire, where tea was sacred, and where a man could legally sell his wife at market like a prize heifer. Not because he was particularly cruel, mind you, though cruelty certainly played its part, but because the alternative was often starvation, debtor's prison, or watching his children waste away while the law tied his hands behind his back with red tape and moral superiority. Before you could even dream of dragging your spouse to market with a halter around her neck, you had to reach that special kind of desperation that only Victorian poverty could provide. The kind of desperation that made grown men weep into their watered down ull while calculating whether their wife's market value exceeded their gambling debts. Step 1. Lose everything. Your job, your dignity, your hope, and preferably your mind, because sanity was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. The recruiter for this particular circus wasn't some uniformed official checking your teeth and muscles. No, desperation recruited you itself, whispering sweet promises in your ear while your stomach gnawed at your spine, and your landlord sharpened his eviction notice. It checked your capacity for shame, not to compliment your moral fibre, but to ensure you could swallow enough pride to stand in a marketplace hawking your wife like yesterday's bread. Empty pockets, perfect. Mounting debts, even better. Children crying for food you couldn't provide, absolutely essential. If you still had your self-respect intact, you weren't desperate enough yet. Come back when you'd pawned your last decent shirt and your neighbours crossed the street rather than lend you another shilling. The market for wives didn't want dignified men. It wanted broken ones, men who'd already traded their souls for the slim hope of survival. And yes, you had to convince yourself this was legal. Not because Parliament had passed some delightfully progressive wife as chattel act, but because common law had this wonderful loophole that treated marriage like any other contract. If both parties agreed, and you followed the proper market protocols, the magistrates would look the other way faster than a bishop caught in a brothel. This wasn't written down anywhere respectable, mind you. It lived in that grey area between technically not illegal and morally reprehensible, which was exactly where most Victorian solutions to poverty resided. Still interested in this particular career path? Excellent. Now find a market day, preferably when the weather was decent and the crowd was thick. You needed witnesses. lots of them, because nothing legitimized the sale of human beings, quite like a good crowd of onlookers pretending they weren't fascinated by the spectacle. They called this following proper procedure, which was Victorian speak for making sure everyone could see how far you'd fallen. The market square became your stage, your wife the reluctant star, and your dignity the admission price everyone paid to watch. Some men were even excited about it. Freedom, they said. A fresh start, they said. Most of them didn't realize that the shame would follow them longer than their shadow, and the guilt would prove more permanent than their wedding vows. Don't think being a respectable tradesman made this easier. In fact, respectability made it mandatory to follow all the ridiculous protocols. If you were the wrong combination of poor and proud, congratulations, you got to orchestrate this humiliation with proper Victorian ceremony. Of course, if you were wealthy, you could afford a proper divorce through the courts, but that required either adultery that could be proven in court or enough money to grace the right palms. For everyone else, there was the market square and a halter rope. And that's just the preparation. So you've reached rock bottom and embraced it like a long, lost friend. You're committed to this path. Wonderful. Now the real performance begins. The systematic destruction of everything you once held sacred about marriage, love, and human dignity. The morning of market day arrived like a hangover, inevitable and unwelcome. Your wife, let's call her Mary, because they were all called Mary in those days, or Elizabeth, or perhaps Sarah if her parents had been feeling particularly creative, woke up knowing this was the day her husband would attempt to transform her from beloved partner to livestock. The conversation over breakfast, assuming you could afford breakfast, was presumably something like, "Pass the thin gruel, dear, and by the way, I'll be offering you for sale after the pig auction." Your new identity wasn't wrapped in leather and brass like a Roman soldier's, but in shame so thick you could practically wear it like a coat. Forget your name as a husband, a provider, a man of any standing whatsoever. You were now simply the merchant of misery, the vendor of vows broken, or more accurately, a walking tragedy with a receipt book. The market square on any given day was a symphony of commerce, a beautiful chaos of bleating sheep, squawking chickens, and haggling voices raised in the eternal dance of supply and demand. Into this respectable world of legitimate trade, you introduced your wife, and suddenly the entire atmosphere shifted like smoke in a changing wind. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children were quickly hustled away by suddenly vigilant mothers. Even the livestock seemed to sense something wasn't quite right with this particular transaction. Your preparation ritual was both simple and soul-crushing. First, the halter. Not a leather dog collar or some makeshift rope, but an actual halter, the kind used for leading cattle to market. This wasn't accidental symbolism. It was deliberate dehumanization, a visual reminder to everyone present that your wife was being reduced to the level of property, a beast to be bought and sold. The rope around her neck served multiple purposes. It satisfied the legal requirement for proper market procedure. It provided a convenient way to display your merchandise, and it ensured that everyone who saw her would understand exactly what was happening. The halter wasn't just functional, it was theatrical. Victorian society loved its rituals, its proper procedures, its elaborate ceremonies that disguised ugly realities behind prettier facades. The wife's sale was no different. By following the established protocol, by using the proper equipment, by conducting the sale in the proper location, participants could pretend this was somehow legitimate, somehow civilized, somehow acceptable. But let's not pretend the halter was comfortable. Rope around the neck never was, whether you were a person or a pig. Your wife stood there, trying to maintain whatever dignity she could muster while wearing the universal symbol of domesticated animals. Some women wept, others maintained a stony silence that spoke louder than any protest. A few, and this was perhaps the most heartbreaking sight of all, actually smiled, because they'd reached that point of despair where even being sold seemed better than remaining trapped in their current circumstances. The crowd that gathered wasn't there for the spectacle alone, though spectacle certainly played its part. These were potential customers, men looking for wives the way they might shop for any other household necessity, a woman to cook, clean, bear children, and ask no inconvenient questions about how she'd been acquired. The market for wives attracted a particular type of buyer. Men who couldn't obtain wives through conventional courtship, either because they lacked the social skills, the financial means, or the basic human decency that most women required in a husband. These weren't necessarily evil men, though evil certainly showed up to these events like vultures to carrion. They were often desperate in their own way, lonely bachelors who'd given up on romance, widowers who needed someone to manage their households, or men whose reputations had made them unmarriageable through normal channels. The wife market was where society's rejects found each other, where the desperate sold to the desperate, and where love had been replaced by practical necessity dressed up as legal transaction. The auctioneer, if you were lucky enough to have one, was usually some local character who'd presided over enough livestock sales to know how to work a crowd. If you weren't lucky, you became your own auctioneer, standing there in the market square hawking your wife's virtues like a carnival barker selling tickets to the freak show. Good teeth, strong back, knows her way around a kitchen, seldom complains, produces healthy children, only slightly damaged by years of poverty and disappointment. The bidding, when it happened at all, was a curious mixture of genuine commerce and elaborate theatre. Men would examine your wife like they were buying a horse, checking her teeth, her posture, asking about her health, her age, her childbearing history. They'd want to know if she could read, if she was good with numbers, if she had any marketable skills beyond the basic domestic duties that every wife was expected to perform. Some would even ask about her temperament, as if a woman standing in a market square with a rope around her neck might somehow be in a cheerful mood. The prices varied wildly, depending on the woman's age, appearance, health, and the depth of her husband's desperation. A young, attractive wife in good health might fetch several pounds, enough to settle significant debts or provide a fresh start in another town. An older woman, or one worn down by childbearing and hard labour, might sell for mere shillings, barely enough to buy a decent meal. Some wives sold for the price of a pint of ale, which said everything you needed to know about both the husband's desperation and the buyer's expectations. But here's where the story gets complicated, because this wasn't just about men selling women like property. Many of these sales were actually elaborate divorces in disguise, carefully orchestrated arrangements that allowed couples to separate when the law provided no other option. The buyer was often the woman's lover, someone she'd chosen herself, someone who'd agreed to participate in this charade to give her a legal way out of an unbearable marriage. Victorian divorce law was a maze designed by people who'd apparently never met an unhappy couple. For a man to divorce his wife, he had to prove adultery. For a woman to divorce her husband, she had to prove not just adultery, but also cruelty, desertion, or some other aggravating circumstance. The process was expensive, humiliating, and often impossible for anyone without significant wealth and social connections. The courts were more interested in preserving the institution of marriage than in helping people escape from marriages that had become prisons. So couples invented their own solution. The wife would find a man willing to buy her, usually someone she actually wanted to be with. The husband would agree to sell her, often because he was equally eager to escape the marriage. The transaction would be conducted in public, with witnesses, following all the traditional protocols that gave it the appearance of legitimacy. Everyone involved understood it was theatre, but theatre that served a practical purpose in a society that had made actual divorce nearly impossible for ordinary people. The women who participated in these sales weren't passive victims, at least not always. Many were active collaborators in their own liberation, using the only tool available to escape marriages that had become unbearable. They'd found men they preferred, arranged the details of the sale, and participated in the charade because it was literally their only legal option for changing their circumstances. Sarah Jenkins, for example, had been married to a drunk who beat her regularly and spent her earnings on gin. She met Thomas Wilson, a widower who treated her with kindness and respect. When Thomas offered to buy her from her husband, she jumped at the chance. The sale was conducted properly, in the market square, with witnesses and all the traditional ceremony. Sarah's husband got enough money to drink himself into a stupor. Sarah got a better life with a decent man, and Thomas got a wife who was genuinely grateful to be with him. Everyone won, except perhaps the abstract concept of marital sanctity, which had already taken quite a beating in their particular household. But not every story ended so neatly. For every Sarah who escaped to a better life, there was a Margaret who was genuinely sold against her will to pay her husband's gambling debts. For every Thomas who bought a wife because he genuinely cared for her, there was a brutish farmer who wanted a woman to work his fields and warm his bed without any pretense of affection or respect. The children of these transactions were often the most tragic figures in the entire drama. Sometimes they went with their mother to her new husband, becoming instant stepchildren in a household where they might or might not be welcome. Sometimes they stayed with their father, watching their mother disappear from their lives like smoke in the wind. And sometimes they were divided up like the rest of the family property, with the older ones going to work and the younger ones following whoever seemed most likely to feed and clothe them. Young Timothy watched his mother sold for £3.06 to a man who smelled of tobacco and leather. She kissed him goodbye and promised to send for him when she could, a promise they both knew she had no power to keep. His father took the money and promptly lost half of it in a card game that same evening. Timothy learned that day that love was a luxury his family couldn't afford, and that adults were just as powerless as children when poverty made the decisions. The buyers in these transactions were a fascinating study in human nature, representing every possible motivation from genuine affection to calculated exploitation. Some were lonely men who'd been widowed and needed companions as much as housekeepers. Others were farmers or tradesmen who required wives to help with their businesses and saw the market as a more efficient way to acquire them than traditional courtship. James Morrison bought his wife because his first wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with 3 young children and a household he couldn't manage alone. He paid £4 for Catherine, a woman whose husband was emigrating to America and couldn't afford to take her with him. It was a practical arrangement that grew into genuine affection over time. Catherine was grateful for a stable home and kind treatment. James was grateful for help with his children and his business. And the children gained a stepmother who treated them better than some natural mothers treated their own offspring. On the other end of the spectrum was William Blackwood, who bought wives the way other men bought horses, for their utility and their ability to endure hard work without complaint. He went through 3 wives in 5 years, each purchased at market when the previous one had worn out from overwork or died in childbirth. William saw women as replaceable tools, and the wife market provided him with a steady supply of desperate women who had no better options available. The market itself adapted to meet demand, developing its own customs, its own etiquette, its own unspoken rules about proper procedure. Sellers learned to time their sales for maximum effect, choosing market days when crowds were largest and potential buyers most numerous. They developed standard presentations, learning which of their wives' qualities to emphasize and which to downplay or conceal entirely. Buyers developed their own expertise, learning to spot good bargains and avoid women who might prove troublesome or expensive to maintain. They checked for signs of disease, evidence of previous hard labor, indications of childbearing capacity. Some even developed reputations as discerning purchasers, men who could spot a quality wife from across the market square and negotiate a fair price without overpaying for damaged goods. The wives themselves learned to present themselves to best advantage, understanding that their future happiness might depend on attracting the right buyer or avoiding the wrong one. They dress as well as their circumstances allowed, arrange their hair to hide grey streaks or thinning spots, and practice expressions that suggested both competence and tractability without looking overly eager or desperately unhappy. Local magistrates and constables usually looked the other way during these transactions, understanding that they served a social function that the formal legal system couldn't address. They were unauthorized divorces conducted in public with enough ceremony to give them the appearance of legitimacy. As long as no one complained too loudly, and as long as the sales followed traditional procedures, the authorities were content to treat them as harmless local customs rather than serious legal violations. The church, predictably, was less tolerant of wife sales, seeing them as attacks on the sanctity of marriage and the divine order that placed husbands permanently above wives in the social hierarchy. Ministers would preach against the practice, warning their congregations about the spiritual dangers of treating marriage as a temporary commercial arrangement rather than a sacred covenant that could only be dissolved by death. But even church opposition was complicated by practical reality. Ministers knew their congregations included people trapped in genuinely terrible marriages, people for whom divorce was both financially impossible and legally unavailable. They understood that sometimes wife sales were the least harmful solution to situations that had no good solutions, ways for people to escape circumstances that were destroying their souls and endangering their lives. Reverend Matthew Hamilton found himself in the awkward position of condemning wife sales from the pulpit on Sunday, while quietly blessing the second marriage of parishioners who'd met through such sales on Monday. He knew perfectly well that Elizabeth Carter had been sold by her abusive first husband to John Peters, a decent man who treated her with kindness and respect. He also knew that refusing to acknowledge their union would leave Elizabeth in spiritual limbo and deny their children the benefits of legitimate birth. So he developed a flexible interpretation of marriage law that allowed him to serve his congregation's needs while maintaining his theological principles, at least in theory. The economic aspects of wife sales revealed uncomfortable truths about Victorian society's treatment of women and marriage. A wife's market value was determined by the same factors that determined the value of any other commodity: supply, demand, condition, and utility. Young, healthy, attractive women commanded higher prices than older or worn-down ones. Women with useful skills like literacy, numeracy, or specialized trades brought premium prices. Women who came with dowries or property were especially valuable, though such women rarely ended up at market in the first place. The pricing also reflected harsh realities about women's economic status in Victorian society. Even the highest prices paid for wives at market were typically less than what a skilled craftsman might earn in a month, less than the cost of a decent horse, less than what many families spent on clothing in a year. This said everything about how society valued women's contributions, treating them as useful but ultimately replaceable household fixtures rather than individuals with inherent worth and dignity. Market records, where they exist, provide fascinating glimpses into these transactions. Sold one wife, Mary Thompson, age 26, good health, can read and cipher, 2 children included, to William Brooks for 4 and 10 shillings. Sold Mrs. Catherine Mills, age 34, excellent cook, strong constitution, no children, to James Fletcher for 3 and 2 shillings. Sold wife of Samuel Davis, name Jane, age 22, with infant son, to Thomas Brown for 2 and 6 shillings. These clinical descriptions reduced complex human beings to their most basic commercial qualities, stripping away everything that made them individuals in favor of characteristics that made them valuable as property. A woman's hopes, dreams, fears, and personality became irrelevant compared to her ability to bear children, manage a household, and endure hardship without complaint. The seasonal nature of wife sales reflected broader economic patterns in Victorian society. Sales peaked during economic downturns, after poor harvests, during periods of high unemployment, or industrial disruption. They were more common in winter, when resources were scarce and survival required desperate measures. They were less common during prosperous times, when families could afford to maintain their current arrangements, even if those arrangements were unsatisfactory. Geographic patterns also emerged, with wife sales being more common in industrial areas where economic volatility made families vulnerable to sudden poverty, and in rural areas where isolation and limited opportunities trapped people in unbearable situations. They were less common in prosperous urban areas, where better legal and social services provided alternatives, and where greater wealth made the desperate measures unnecessary. The social aftermath of wife sales varied enormously depending on the circumstances and the people involved. Some couples who separated this way maintained friendly relationships, understanding that they'd helped each other escape difficult situations as best they could under impossible circumstances. Others never spoke again, carrying resentment and shame for the rest of their lives. Children of these broken families often struggled with the psychological impact of watching their parents treat marriage as a commercial transaction. Some grew up with deeply cynical views of love and commitment, having learned early that adult relationships could be dissolved for money when circumstances required it. Others developed stronger appreciation for stable relationships, having seen firsthand what happened when marriages failed and families disintegrated. The new marriages that resulted from wife sales had their own unique challenges and opportunities. Couples who came together through market transactions started their relationships with unusual honesty about their practical needs and expectations. There was no romantic illusion to maintain, no pretense that love had brought them together. They knew exactly why they were together and what each expected from the arrangement. This brutal honesty could actually be advantageous in creating stable marriages. Without romantic expectations to disappoint or sentimental notions to conflict with reality, couples could focus on building practical partnerships based on mutual benefit and respect. Many of these marriages proved more durable than conventional marriages that had started with passionate love but lacked practical compatibility. Catherine and James, who met when he bought her at market, developed a relationship based on mutual gratitude and respect that grew into genuine affection over time. She was grateful for his kindness and the stability he provided. He was grateful for her help with his children and his household. They understood their relationship was primarily practical, but that understanding allowed them to appreciate small kindnesses and build trust gradually without the pressure of living up to romantic ideals. The legal status of these new marriages was always somewhat precarious, existing in the grey area between legitimate and illegitimate that characterized so many aspects of working class life in Victorian England. Most couples simply lived together as husband and wife without worrying too much about official recognition, understanding that their neighbours' acceptance mattered more than legal documents they couldn't afford anyway. When legal challenges did arise, usually over inheritance or children's legitimacy, the outcomes were unpredictable. Some judges recognized wife sales as valid divorces and subsequent marriages as legitimate. Others declared the entire process invalid and ruled that the original marriage remained in effect regardless of any market transactions. The inconsistency meant that couples never knew for certain whether their relationships would be recognized by law if circumstances required legal intervention. The wives themselves adapted to their new circumstances in ways that revealed remarkable resilience and pragmatism. Women who'd been sold often developed stronger senses of their own agency and value, having learned that they could survive even the most humiliating circumstances and build new lives from nothing. They'd been through the worst thing that could happen to a married woman in Victorian society and survived it, which gave them confidence to handle whatever other challenges life might present. Some became advocates for other women in similar situations, providing informal counseling and support for wives considering market sales or dealing with their aftermath. They understood the complex motivations and emotions involved better than anyone else could, and their advice was often more practical and helpful than anything available from official sources. Mary Henderson, who'd been sold twice and finally found happiness with her third husband, became something of an expert on wife sales in her community. Women would seek her out for advice on timing, presentation, and selecting buyers. She helped negotiate deals, provided emotional support during difficult transitions, and offered practical advice on starting over with new families. Her own experiences had taught her that survival required pragmatism over sentiment, and she passed those lessons on to other women facing impossible choices. The children of these transactions often developed complex relationships with the practice that had reshaped their families. Some grew up grateful that their mothers had found ways to escape abusive or impoverished situations, understanding that the alternatives might have been worse. Others carried lifelong resentment about being treated as property to be divided up along with the household goods. Young Robert never forgave his father for selling his mother, but he also never forgave his mother for allowing herself to be sold. He grew up believing that both parents had chosen their own interests over their children's welfare, and he carried that resentment into his own marriage, becoming the kind of jealous, controlling husband who made his wife's life miserable because he was determined never to be abandoned again. But Robert's sister Susan drew different lessons from the same experience. She saw how her mother had been trapped in a marriage with a violent drunk and had found the courage to escape in the only way available to her. Susan grew up admiring her mother's strength and resourcefulness, and she passed those qualities on to her own daughters, teaching them that survival sometimes required difficult choices, and that women were stronger than society wanted them to believe. The broader social implications of wife sales revealed the inadequacies of Victorian marriage law and the desperate situations that drove people to such extreme measures. These transactions were symptoms of a legal system that had failed to keep pace with social realities, leaving people trapped in situations that served no one's interests and destroyed families without providing any constructive alternatives. The persistence of wife sales throughout the Victorian era, despite official disapproval and social stigma, demonstrated that they filled a genuine social need that the formal legal system couldn't address. People created their own solutions to problems that society refused to acknowledge or address, developing informal institutions that provided practical relief even when they violated official moral and legal standards. Reform movements gradually began to address some of the underlying issues that made wife sales necessary. Though progress was slow and often resisted by conservatives who preferred maintaining traditional arrangements, even when those arrangements were clearly harmful, the expansion of divorce law, improvements in women's legal status, and better economic opportunities for working-class families all contributed to reducing the desperate circumstances that drove people to market their spouses. But change came slowly and unevenly, and wife sales continued well into the 20th century in some areas, adapting to changing circumstances while serving essentially the same function they'd always served, providing desperate people with options when the formal legal system offered them none. The last recorded wife sale in England occurred in 1913, when a woman was sold for 1 shilling in a Yorkshire market town. By then, the practice had become an anachronism, a relic of a time when poverty and legal inflexibility had forced people to create their own solutions to problems that proper society preferred to ignore. The legacy of wife sales lives on in the historical record as a reminder of how desperate people can become when trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and how creative they can be in finding solutions when official institutions fail them. These transactions weren't just about treating women as property, though that was certainly part of the story. They were about people trying to survive in a system that offered them few good choices and no official help in making the difficult decisions that poverty and social constraints forced upon them. The men who sold their wives weren't necessarily monsters, though monsters certainly participated in the practice. They were often desperate people trying to solve impossible problems with the only tools available to them. The women who were sold weren't necessarily victims, though victimization was certainly common. Many were active participants in their own liberation, using the only legal mechanism available to escape unbearable situations. The buyers weren't necessarily exploiters, though exploitation was common enough. Many were lonely people seeking companionship, practical people needing household help, or kind people trying to rescue women from difficult circumstances. The complexity of these relationships defies simple moral judgments, revealing instead the complicated ways that poverty, legal constraints, and social expectations interacted to create situations where no good choices existed. Understanding wife sales requires understanding the broader context of Victorian society, where individual desires were subordinated to social stability, where legal institutions served property owners better than they served ordinary people, and where survival often required pragmatic compromises that violated official moral standards. These transactions were products of their time and place, symptoms of social conditions that made desperate measures seem reasonable to people who had exhausted all other options. The stories of individual families caught up in wife sales revealed both the worst and best of human nature under extreme pressure. Some people responded to desperate circumstances with cruelty, selfishness, and exploitation. Others responded with remarkable kindness, creativity, and resilience, finding ways to help each other survive and even thrive despite impossible circumstances. The market squares where these transactions took place became stages for some of the most dramatic human stories of the Victorian era, places where desperation and hope, exploitation and liberation, tragedy and comedy all played out in full view of communities that were simultaneously scandalized and fascinated by the spectacle of marriage reduced to commerce. But perhaps the most important lesson from the history of wife sales is how ordinary people responded when formal institutions failed them. Rather than simply accepting intolerable situations, they created their own solutions, developed their own customs, and built their own informal support systems. They treated marriage as a practical arrangement that could be modified when circumstances required it, rather than as an immutable sacred bond that had to be endured regardless of its human cost. The practice eventually died out not because people became more moral or less desperate, but because social and legal changes provided better alternatives for people trapped in unbearable marriages. Divorce became more accessible and affordable. Women gained greater legal rights and economic opportunities, and social safety nets reduced the kind of desperate poverty that had made wife sales seem like reasonable solutions to impossible problems. The Victorian era's wife market stand as monuments to human adaptability in the face of systemic failure, reminders that people will find ways to survive and help each other even when official institutions offer them no assistance or hope. They were products of their time, but they also revealed timeless truths about how people respond when trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and how creative they can be in finding solutions when society offers them none. The halter that symbolized these transactions wasn't just a rope around a woman's neck. It was a symbol of social constraints that trapped entire families in impossible situations, legal systems that served some people better than others, and economic conditions that made survival more important than dignity. But it was also a symbol of human resourcefulness, the willingness to endure humiliation if it meant finding a path to something better, and the complex ways that people helped each other navigate systems that were designed to serve other interests entirely. In the end, the tragedy wasn't that men sold their wives in Victorian markets. The tragedy was that social conditions made such sales seem like reasonable solutions to problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The real story of wife sales isn't about the transactions themselves, but about the broader social failures that made such desperate measures necessary, and the remarkable resilience of ordinary people who found ways to survive and help each other despite impossible circumstances. These weren't stories of simple victimization or exploitation, though both certainly occurred. They were stories of complex human relationships under extreme pressure, of people trying to do the best they could with limited options, of families adapting to survive when formal institutions offered them no help or hope. Understanding these stories requires setting aside simple moral judgments in favor of deeper appreciation for the complicated ways that social systems, economic pressures, and individual choices interacted to create situations where desperate measures seemed like reasonable solutions. The men, women, and children who participated in wife sales weren't heroes or villains, but ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, trying to build decent lives despite social conditions that made decency difficult and dignity expensive. Their stories remind us that understanding the past requires more than moral judgment. It requires empathy for people who faced choices we hope never to face ourselves, an appreciation for the remarkable ways they found to help each other survive when survival itself seemed impossible.